fantastic. So welcome to the first CSEP and 80,000 hours event of this term and of the year. We're honored. I'm Arnav Kapoor. I'm the president of the Cambridge Society for Economic Pluralism. And we have Adam, who's the president of the 80,000 Hours Cambridge Society. Now, today we're honored to have Simon Anholt to come speak on which country does the most good, which is quite an open, big question. I think we're quite fortunate to have such a good speaker on that matter. Professor Simon Anholt has begun campaigning on this matter. He's created a Good Country Index as well as a Good Country Party. In order to promote this campaign, he'll discuss more about that movement in his talk. He's served as the vice chair of the UK's Foreign Office Public Diplomacy Board. He's got an award in the Nobel Colloquial Prize in Economics in 2010, as well as multiple other awards, and has a TED Talk with in excess of 2 million views. I saw him speak last year at the Cambridge Development Initiative's launch, and I can hands down say he's the best speaker I've ever seen, so this should be a fantastic talk. Yeah, without further ado, Simon Anholt.
Well, thank you very much, Arnav, and thank you to all of you for coming. You can hear me at the back? I can hear me at the back, so I guess you can too. I don't really want to give a lecture or a talk. I'd much rather share some of my doubts with you, because I have a lot of doubts, and I wonder if maybe you might be able to help me resolve some of them. Because you, as predominantly undergraduates, and I'm assuming, looking at your faces, that the majority of you are undergraduates, are very much my core target audience, to use a brutal term. The message of the good country is a message which seems to resonate more profoundly and more reliably with university undergraduates than any other group. And there are various reasons for this, which I won't bore you with. But when I'm talking to a group like this, I feel quite relaxed and I feel quite at home. It's partly to do with the fact that at your time of life, many of you are not as cynical as people tend to become once they've started having to deal with job and mortgage and family and all the rest of it. There's a sad tendency in our society, in fact many Western societies, to tend to criticize things. Indeed, to tend to use criticism as a demonstration of intelligence. And I think that this is rather corrosive. Of course, one has to be wary of ideas. Of course, one has to think critically. There's no question about it. But one of the things that I think is very wrong with Western societies today is this almost unquestioned assumption that the way that you can demonstrate your intelligence to others most effectively is by quickly pointing out all the reasons why any new idea cannot possibly work. And that's really bad news, because it basically means that society goes one step forward and 2 steps backwards. And any meeting that you go to once you've launched into the world of work, you'll quickly begin to recognize this syndrome. You'll find this pattern repeating over and over again, that somebody is brave enough and smart enough to come up with a new thought or a new idea. And they'll be brave enough to express it to the group. And almost immediately, somebody, quite often quite nicely, will explain to them in front of everybody else why their idea can't possibly work. And that person has learned in that moment never again to suggest an idea, because they will be utterly, utterly humiliated by the experience. So is it therefore surprising that companies, corporations, have a stronger tendency to be uncreative and conservative than to be creative and progressive? So this was just a very long way of saying that I like you. And I hope that you won't let me down on that. And you won't prove to be the exception to the rule, that you're a bunch of people who are incredibly negative and cynical, even though you haven't yet hit 30, most of you. Anyway, I want to tell you about the good country. I want to tell you where it came from and the basic idea behind it. And then I'd like to tell you about my concerns, my questions, my doubts about the future and where it goes. We'll have some time for question and answer at the end. I'd like it to be more answer than question, actually, because I would like you to tell me what you think. I'd like you to give me some answers. And if you can't today, then that's absolutely fine. We can keep the conversation going in so many other ways. But I would like you to treat this as me asking you a question rather than me giving you a lecture. But I will tell you the story. So the story starts, well, I suppose quite a few years ago. Back in the 1990s, I started getting really interested in the idea of perceptions of nations and perceptions of places generally. How people think about other countries, countries that they may not know very much about, countries that they may not have visited. We all seem to have quite strong ideas about what a certain number of other countries are like. And it occurred to me that those perceptions were measurable, and that it would be kind of fun to do a big global poll and try to find out what most people actually thought about other countries, see how correct those perceptions were, and to see whether they changed over time. And I discovered that there are indeed very fixed ideas about what America is, what Switzerland is. America is a very large country full of big fat bullies who make the world a more difficult place for everybody else. Switzerland is a country where everybody is incredibly clean and efficient and rather dull, and they do things very well and very secretively. And Sweden is basically the same thing as Switzerland, but it has a bit of added sex appeal. And so it goes on. In Italy, nobody ever does any work. They spend the whole time playing the violin and eating pasta, and so on and so on and so on. So, surprise, surprise, there are a number of fairly pervasive cliches about other countries which are held by enormous numbers of people. But I began to start wondering what the economic impact of those prejudices, those cliches, was. Because after all, countries today depend to an astonishing degree on international trade of one kind or another for their economic progress. Most countries, they depend on getting tourists, and that's very much a question of image, how they're perceived. They depend on foreign investment, and that also is related to how they're perceived. They depend on exporting their products, and the country of origin of those products can have a profound effect on the success that those products meet with when they're sold abroad. And in many, many different ways, the image of a country probably has an impact on that country's economic performance and progress, which certainly deserves to be studied. So I launched a study in 2005, which started performing a regular measurement of national images. And at the same time, I started working as an independent advisor to governments around the world on this and other related questions. Understanding what their image was, and trying to understand how they deserved that image, what they'd done or what they'd failed to do to deserve that image, how it impacted their performance and their society and their general role in the world. And this was a fascinating job. I know it sounds like a cliche to say it, but it was actually a privilege. It continues to be a privilege doing that job, because I get to sit down with the people who run countries, with the presidents and the prime ministers and the monarchs, often in a very small group, often very informally, and often quite secretly, discussing with them very frankly what their view is about the future of their nation and its role in the world. On the whole, I've discovered that the people who run countries are quite nice. They're not actually a bunch of villains on the whole. I think most of us probably imagine that anybody who can be described as a politician is by definition evil and cynical and dastardly. It's actually not the case. The overwhelming majority of them aren't bad people at all. They actually have, the overwhelming majority, a fairly elevated notion of public service. They do what they do in many, many, many cases out of a sense of duty. Whether they do it well or not is an entirely different matter, and most of them do it rather badly as far as I can see. But it is, on the other hand, a very, very difficult job running a country. A country is an extremely complicated thing. And especially if you've got a population of many millions, or tens of millions, or hundreds of millions. Boy, is that a tough job. And we, citizens, hold them to account in a way that is terrifyingly rigorous in many, many cases. But there you go. So it was a great job, and it continues to be a great job. And after doing this for a number of years, I realized in around about 2014 that I'd done this kind of advisory work for probably 40 different countries, which is quite a big chunk of all the countries that there are. And I had achieved precisely nothing. I hadn't actually succeeded in making any of these countries change their behavior at all. I like to think that I taught them a few things which they found interesting. Oh, sure, and there were a few projects here and there which I encouraged them to execute because I thought it would be good for their global standing, and a few of them did a few good things. But really what I was trying to do was much more ambitious than that. What I was really trying to do was to make them become gooder. Now, I know that gooder isn't a proper English word, but I persist in using it because the proper English word better sounds like a value judgment. When you say a better country, that means somehow a more beautiful or more successful country, and that's not really what I meant. I meant more good. I wanted them to become countries that did more for humanity and for the planet. And around about 2014, I decided I was going to stop. And I was going to take the accumulated database of all of the research I'd conducted over the previous 10 years on people's perceptions of countries and try to find out if there were any fundamental truths in there about which countries people admired and why, and what the consequences of that admiration could be. Because those seem to me to be big and quite interesting questions. Why do people admire country A more than country B? There's got to be a reason. I mean, it doesn't take a great deal of imagination to figure out why somebody might prefer Canada to South Sudan. Because Canada is wealthier, because, depending on your taste, you might think that it offers more tourist attractions. You may find that you may believe that it's a country that it would be easier to live in, and depending on who you are, you may well be right about that. But why do people prefer the Czech Republic to the Slovak Republic when they know absolutely nothing about either? And yet, time after time after time, the results in that survey are always the same. Whoever I ask, the questions always bring back the same answers. The study, which is not available in the public domain, it's so expensive to run that I have to sell the results to governments rather shamefully, so I can't share it with you, unfortunately, on the internet. But it's called the Nation Brands Index. I use the word brand in a rather cynical way because it makes it look as if countries are like products. It is the most boring survey ever conducted because year after year after year after year, it simply never changes. And it seems as if it doesn't matter what happens to a country, it just doesn't change people's views about it, except in a very small number of very, very tiny ways, which are really very interesting. So, 2014, I took some time off and I started having a look at the accumulated database, as I said, of this survey. By that time, I'd collected about 200 billion data points. So there's a lot of data in there. It's because it's a very large survey conducted in a very large number of countries every year over more than a decade. And as I began to look, with some help from people who actually know about statistics, as distinct from me, who knows nothing, I should add, we began to discover that there was a very, very, very interesting pattern going on. And we discovered that there are some very, very clear reasons why people admire one country more than another. And I won't go into detail because that would be a lecture and it would be boring. Suffice to say that the clearly most important reason why anybody admires any other country is because they believe that it's good. Good in the sense that I mentioned before. In other words, it's a country that contributes something to the world that we all live in. It's funny, but nobody gives a damn, really, how successful other countries are. And maybe that's not so funny because, after all, why would you? You don't live there, so it doesn't affect you. And it's quite amusing to look at the way that governments try to promote their countries by bragging about their achievements and their successes and imagining that everybody is going to make this admire them. But why should it? I don't live in your damn country. I don't care how successful you are, or how beautiful you are, or how well you treat your citizens, because I'm not one of them. And in fact, the more governments continue to brag about how wonderful their countries are, the more likely I am to become annoyed and start hating that country. No, the reason why I admire a country, the reason why you admire a country, statistically speaking, and you may not recognize this consciously, but at the level of statistical evidence appears to be more than any other reason because you feel that it's an overall contributor to the planet that we all share and to the humanity of which we are all a part. Now, when I discovered that result, I thought it was too good to be true. I didn't want to believe it because it was so close to what I'd been saying all along to these governments that I thought, apart from anything else, nobody would believe me. They'd just say, you cooked this up to confirm what you've already been talking about. But then I thought about it a bit longer, and I discussed it with more people, and in the end we realized that actually it's logical. The reason why we admire countries who we think do something for humanity is because they are the countries that are least likely to cause trouble in the world that we live in. So I don't go to bed at night, for example, terrified that I'm going to be awoken at 3 a.m. by Norwegian terrorists standing around my bed. Perhaps I should, but I don't worry about that half as much as I would worry about, I don't know where terrorists might come from, but somewhere else a bit more dodgy than Norway. And so one way and another, there are certain countries, as a result of certain cues and stimuli, that we feel we can trust because we think that they are contributors to a more safe, more just, more prosperous, more stable, more comforting world. And the countries that we feel damage that system, threaten the stability and the peacefulness of the global system, are the ones that we like less. And the fact that we like them more or like them less, admire them more or admire them less, has a profound impact on their economic performance. Because, as I said before, if we like them and admire them, we are far more likely to visit them as tourists. We are far more likely to buy their products. We are far more likely to hire their citizens if we run a company. We're far more likely to invest in their economy if we're an investor. If we mistrust them, if we think they're dodgy, if we think they disturb the natural order of the planet that we all share, we're far less likely to do those things. So it's a two-stage argument, but there is an indirect causal relationship between the amount of good a country does and how well it does. Now, if that argument sounds familiar, it's because it is familiar. It's exactly the same principle as corporate social responsibility. Companies discovered this principle in the early Middle Ages, that if you want people to trust you and become your customers, your loyal customers, you have to demonstrate your morality. You have to prove, as for example, the Florentine banking families did in the 15th century, that you are a good Christian, in their case, a good moral person. You spend your profits on setting up hospitals and caring for the sick and paying painters to decorate the ceilings of the chapels of various popes. This principle of corporate social responsibility is very well understood and has been for centuries and centuries. And I guess the only argument that I was making from 2014 onwards is that the same principle applies as much to nations as it does to corporations. And that therefore the message to governments today is the same message that corporate governance has also received. If you want to do well, you have to do good. I cannot tell you how happy this discovery made me, because in an otherwise really quite gloomy moment in history, suddenly I seem to have found a really quite robust, practical, non-ethical, non-moral argument for why countries should start behaving a bit better. Now, we all know why they need to behave a bit better. Let me come at this from the other angle very briefly, and you'll see what I mean. We live in the age of globalization. Again, globalization has been going on for a very long time. Those Florentine banking families in the 15th century that I mentioned before, they were also responding to an early stage of globalization. They were setting up the earliest pan-European enterprises. But the age of great globalization, of rapid globalization, is our age. And it's causing things to proceed at the most tremendous rate. And as I always say, it's important that we remember that globalization is a tide that lifts all vessels, the good and the bad. Globalization is good for good things, and it's good for bad things too. And at the moment, because we, the human species, are not terribly good at organizing ourselves, we've been left a little bit unprepared by globalization. And so what we've allowed to happen is that a great many problems have become globalized much more successfully than the solutions have. You take almost any problem that used to be a relatively small local problem, and globalization has made it into a gigantic, systemic, persistent, intractable problem. Little things. In the TED talk which Arnav mentioned, I spoke about chickens in East Asia. A chicken in East Asia 20 years ago, if it had caught a cold and sneezed and fell over and died, then it would have been a tragedy for the chicken and its immediate relatives. But we wouldn't for a moment have started fearing a global pandemic and the deaths of millions. Likewise, if a small bank in North America had failed because it had lent too much or unwisely, we'd have thought, well, that's the end of the bank, but we wouldn't have thought that's the collapse of the global financial system for the best part of a decade. The drugs industry used to be a series of little local cottage industries. It's now a system, a complex system of efficient, hidden, gigantic multinational corporations. So almost every problem that humanity faces has now become well out of the reach of any individual body, organization, or nation to be able to resolve. Mexico can't fix narco-trafficking. That's an illusion, because it's like that arcade game, which I think is called whack-a-mole, where you hit the mole and another one pops up somewhere else. That's the way it is with narco-trafficking. Mexico, even if it collaborates, as indeed it does, with the United States and Colombia, is still nowhere near to being able to tackle its own drugs problem, because it extends way beyond the visible surface. And the same is true of almost anything else. You look at any country that's the victim of any global challenge, and you will realize how utterly impotent that nation is in the face of its challenge. Actually, not just nations, but entire regions. The European Union is currently almost impotent in the face of the migration so-called crisis. I say so-called crisis because anybody who thinks that it was unexpected probably needs their head looking at. And anybody who thinks that this is it also needs their head looking at. Because what we're facing at the moment, the potential 1 million migrants into the European Union this year, is but a tiny, tiny aperitif of the vast flood of migrants which climate change is going to be producing in the coming years. So we face an age in which none of the conventional organizations of human beings are big enough, organized enough, or powerful enough to be able to tackle any of the problems which are really seriously threatening life on Earth and the future of humanity. The multilateral organizations, the UN agencies, apart from some notable successes, mainly in the area of the Millennium Development Goals, generally speaking are unable to cope, just as the nations are unable to cope. They were created in an age very different from our own, for purposes very different from our own, and they're not really managing either. So, if you want an excessively simple diagnosis of the world's problems, it's this. All of those big challenges, whether it's climate change or human rights or migration or pandemics or narco-trafficking or landmines or nuclear proliferation or whatever the hell you want it to be, all of those challenges are not in themselves the problem. They are all symptoms of the far bigger, far more serious underlying problem that we, humanity, have not yet figured out that we are we, humanity. We still think that we are citizens of nations. We still think that we have different competing agendas. So the reason why we don't collaborate any better than we do is basically because the problems have become 21st century globalized problems, but humanity is still organized in 200 competing tribes called nations. And the nation, and the concept of the nation, hasn't been updated basically since the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648? Wow, you know what I mean. Way back then. We still think of the nation as being the unit which fends for itself. And above that level of national sovereignty, everything has to look after itself. The world, the planet, humanity has to look after itself. And it's patently incapable of doing so. Those nations still have competition deeply ingrained in their DNA, in their systems, in their structures, in their laws, in their cultures. It's all about fighting against other nations. And thanks to the job I've been doing for the last 20 years, I've seen this so closely, so intimately. I've never met a politician who doesn't have this idea of national competition, the national interest, written into their blood and their bones. Politicians feel that when they're elected to office, they have a very simple, single, traditional mandate which they have to perform as long as they have power, which is to look after their own people and their own slice of territory. And if, in order to do that, they have to do some harm to some other citizens of some other nation, well, that's not their problem. That's the problem of the government that's supposed to be looking after those other people. It's pretty childish, but it's the way the whole system works. My view is that because of the age that we've reached, and because of this extraordinary divergence between the globalization of problems and the inadequate globalization of solutions, we need to change that mandate. Today, we need politicians, and not just politicians, anybody in a position of power over any other person, to understand that they now have a dual mandate. The dual mandate says this: when you are elected into office, or when you seize power, or when you're put on the board, you're responsible, yes, for your own people, but also for every man, woman, child, and animal on the planet. You are responsible, yes, for your own slice of territory, but also for every square mile of the Earth's surface and the atmosphere above it. That is the dual mandate. And that has to be the new culture of governance in the age that we live in, otherwise we're in deep, deep trouble. Now, of course, as you might expect, when I say this to politicians, and I say it to presidents and prime ministers, they look at me as if I were bonkers, and they say, "You're out of your mind. I have enough trouble looking after my own parliamentary party and their interests and the capital city and its territory, let alone 7 billion people, most of whom I've never met, and anyway, who can't vote for me." But of course, I'm not saying to governments that they need to treat all of these people with equal priority. Of course, as a government, you have to treat your own people as your top priority. But what I'm saying is, you can't ignore the rest. You can't pretend you have no responsibility for them. We live in an age where our area of influence is far, far greater than our area of responsibility. We are given responsibility over a small area and a small number of people, but we influence many more lives, and we have to simply become aware of that. So the Good Country Index was an attempt to start to help people to understand where I was getting at with this idea. And it turned out to be, in some ways, a little bit more, I can't find the, escape, quick, let me out of here. It turned out to be a little bit more controversial than I was expecting, not least because it turned out, it's tiny print, I'm sorry, but it turned out that the goodest country on earth was Ireland, which surprised and delighted me. The first thing I should say was this edition, which is so far the only edition of the Good Country Index, was published in 2014, but the data in it comes from about 2010, 2011, because that's how long it takes to collect global data on what countries do. So let me just explain to you very quickly how it works. Basically, along the top there, where you see the colored bars, you've got 7 categories of impact that a country can have on the rest of the world. Its impact on global science and technology, its impact on global culture, its impact on international peace and security, world order, planet and climate, prosperity and equality, and health and well-being. Each of those 7 sections has basically got 5 individual data sets in it. And those data sets are actual measures of actual national performance, which are mostly collected by UN agencies and 1 or 2 other big multilateral organizations. So, for example, if you take science and technology, one of the questions in there is how many academic publications were published internationally that came from your country. So that's one small way of measuring, or at least providing a token for your contribution to global science and technology. The number of Nobel Prize winners your country has produced also comes into that. On international peace and security, the number of people who you've killed outside your own borders is a negative indicator, you'll be relieved to hear. So the number of people who die as a result of your activities outside your own borders will lose you ranking. On the other hand, if you are up to date with your contributions to United Nations peacekeeping efforts, then you will gain points. And overall, we end up with these 7 different category rankings. I don't know whether you can see it, but it's quite interesting. The yellow one, international peace and security, presents a very, very different ranking from the overall one. You take a country like Sweden, which ranks overall 6th. I think Sweden ranks 6th in every index that's ever been compiled. They are just such a perfect country, except that on international peace and security, Sweden ranks 111th, which is very near the bottom of the index. So what's going on there? I thought Sweden was wonderful and peaceful and all the rest of it. Well, they are, except that a really big chunk of their economy comes from exporting weapons. And weapons, last time I checked, are generally used to hurt and kill people. And so however careful you may be to try and make sure that the weapons are only used by good guys, still, they're responsible for terminating life, and call me old-fashioned, but I don't think that's very nice. The other reason, of course, for Sweden coming 111th is because in around about 2010, 2011, Sweden was one of the countries that was in Afghanistan with the ISAF force busily killing the Taliban. And some people, probably the majority of people here, would agree with me that the Taliban were the bad guys in that particular case, but not everybody agrees. And so I'm forced to be a little bit old-fashioned about it and say that whether you're killing good guys or bad guys, whoever you think are good guys or bad guys, killing people is wrong. And to paraphrase von Clausewitz, if you end up killing people, it means that everything else you're capable of doing has failed, and you therefore have to take responsibility for the fact that you're now compelled to terminate people. And so it goes on. There's a lot of interesting stuff in there. It's highly, highly controversial, which is kind of cool. It is highly, highly unreliable, which is kind of uncool. But that's simply because so much of what determines a country's impact on the rest of the world is not measurable. So many good things that countries do to the rest of humanity, and so many bad things that countries do to the rest of humanity just cannot be expressed in data. And this is a study which only eats data. So I get a lot of angry people writing to me and saying, don't you know what we did last year? And the chances are I do know what you did last year, but there's no way of expressing it in an objective, data-driven way. But, as I always say to people, the answers to the world's problems are not going to be found in this or in any other index, but they may just be found in the discussions that this index and other indexes stimulate. So the point is to have the discussion, and the point is to argue about these results, whether they're right or wrong, and in doing so, to start asking a new question about countries. Not how well is it doing, but how much is it doing? You may notice that this approach is very, very different from the conventional economic development approach. I'm really not very interested or impressed by the idea that the problems of the world are caused by poverty, that there are two hemispheres divided by a line called the equator. And broadly speaking, the bottom hemisphere is terribly unhappy because it doesn't have enough things called dollars. And the top hemisphere is doing absolutely great because they have loads of dollars. And that therefore the way to fix the world is to transfuse as many dollars from above the line to below the line. We've been trying that for decades. And it's perfectly obvious that in many, many cases it does more harm than good. I don't think this is about trying to make rich countries feel guilty that they're richer than poor countries. I think the northern hemisphere is in need of aid of different kinds just as much as the southern hemisphere. I don't really like the idea of the poor world and the rich world and it being the duty of the rich world to help the poor world. I like the idea of this being a planet of 200-odd nations, each of which has an equal responsibility to be a good ancestor and to try to make this a planet that actually works and a species that actually survives. This has very little to do with money, by the way. A lot of people have said, well, they're all rich countries on the top. It's obvious that they've got the time and the leisure and the spare cash to think about helping others. Well, as I just said, it's not about helping others, but also it's not really about money. I think out of the 35 data sets, probably only 3 of them are really anything to do with the size of your economy. And anyway, the rankings are normalized by GDP. So even if you have got a larger GDP, it shouldn't actually, in theory, benefit your ranking in the index. But the best result of all, as I mentioned in my TED talk, is the fact that Kenya comes into the top 30, neatly proving that this is nothing to do with money at all. This is to do with whether you're a global citizen or not. So I should stop very, very soon. So I'm going to stop with my promised question to you. All I've really given you so far is what I've got, which is an analysis born out of, I suppose, 20 years rather slow thinking about how the world works and what's gone wrong. I have a very simple model here about what I think the real problem is with the age that we live in and why it's getting worse and not getting better. I also have, in one sense, a very simple solution to that problem. Countries have to become gooder, and that will only happen if their citizens tell their governments to behave differently. I want to live in a good country. That's the message. We need populations to start going to their politicians and telling them a different story. So when, in this country, David Cameron goes to the climate change summit in Paris, our message to him should not be try and get the best deal for our country so that we can emit slightly more than anybody else and still get away with it. Our message to him should be sit down with your colleagues and come back with the best deal for everybody. Now, in a sense, that's quite easy to visualize when it comes to climate change because it's such an easy problem to understand. When it comes to some of these other issues, it's a little bit harder to imagine. But take refugees. There's a very, very beautiful story that emerged in the media a few weeks ago, I'm sure you saw it, about the government of Iceland setting a rather modest number for the Syrian families that it was going to take in over the coming few years. And a brave woman in Iceland, a lawyer, I think, set up a Facebook page saying, not in my name, I don't see what the problem is. We can afford it. I can have a Syrian family in my spare room. If they can't afford to come to Iceland, I'll pay for their ticket to Reykjavik. And within 48 hours, I think it was, a significant proportion, was it 15% of the population of Iceland, had signed up to her Facebook page and said, yes, I'll have a Syrian family in my bedroom. Now, that is an example, and I'm seeing more and more of these examples every day, which clearly show that politicians, even young politicians, are a little bit old-schooled and are still thinking in that 17th century way that their job is to fight for the best deal for their own people. And they're increasingly, it seems, out of kilter with their own citizens, who actually, as they get, as time progresses, and younger people grow up, they're increasingly taking a more global view, a more cosmopolitan view. They don't think that foreigners are aliens. They think that foreigners are human beings just like them. They don't think that other countries are enemies to be neutralized or customers to be sold to. They think there are other places where other people live. And so increasingly we find that populations are beginning to feel that domestic politics doesn't begin to understand the world in the way that it ought to. So that, I think, is the beginning of a popular movement. That, I think, is the beginning of the dawning of a really interesting split between those in power and those not in power, which could be leveraged to achieve something really great. Here's my question. How are we going to do it? How are we going to get sufficient numbers of people peacefully and constructively, I'm very clear about that, to send a message to their own governments to tell them that their job has changed, that these days they have a dual mandate, and to help them to understand that that's not actually an impossible thing to pursue. Take it from me, I'm a policy advisor. I've seen so many examples over the years of ways in which that governments can make enlightened policy that benefits their own people and the rest of the planet. It's perfectly doable. It's not an impossible challenge. How are we going to get that message out? I'm going to leave you with one final statistic. I don't know if you're familiar with the World Values Survey. It's a fascinating piece of research that's carried out every year by an NGO. And it's got a very large questionnaire sent out to a large sample of people in a large number of countries. Asks them all kinds of value questions about religion, about family, about work, about society, about the nations of the world, about global challenges, and so on and so forth. It's a fantastic resource. And my colleague Robert Govis and I sat down with the most recent data from the World Values Survey with a simple question that we wanted to answer, which is, how many people in the world agree with everything I've just said here? How many people really do believe, as I do, that nations should start competing a bit, collaborating a bit more and competing a bit less? How many people believe, as I do, that we all need to take equal responsibility for our future and start thinking about being good ancestors? How many people believe, as I do, that foreigners are not aliens, they are human beings just like us, and we care about them, irrespective of where they come from or what the hell they look like? Well, I wanted to know how many people on Earth believed that, because I heard from a lot of them after my TED Talk went out, and they were writing to me from left, right, and center, saying the most touching things, hundreds of emails every week, saying, this makes sense, I understand, what can I do? So I wanted to know what the total number was, and the World Values Survey suggests, at a very conservative estimate, that it must be about 10% of the world's population. Now, my initial reaction to that was a slight sense of disappointment. 10 sounds like a small percentage, but then again, 10% of 7 billion is 700 million. And 700 million is a very, very large number indeed. So I reckon that we've got a potential movement of 700 million people who already agree with every word that I've just said, at least in principle. So it doesn't become a gigantic problem of persuading people to change their minds or their worldview. It becomes a relatively simple problem of contacting those people and getting them on board. How are we going to do that, those 700 million? Bearing in mind that there's no money. That's the challenge. This is not the kind of thing that Bill and Melinda Gates are going to fund, because it's kind of cranky. So that's the question I would like to leave you with. And I also would like to thank you for listening so patiently for so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for that informative and highly inspirational talk. We'll now open to the floor for Q&A. Before we do that, I'd like to draw your attention to on the desk in front of you, there should be a feedback form. We are, like Simon, very much driven by data and would really appreciate your input so we can keep on improving our events. Anyone have any questions?
What happened? Did you change your mind?
Yeah, so like why is this called perhaps a good country, perhaps not like a good citizen? Because you talked about the fact that like the grant money, you don't necessarily agree in how sort of states and nations apply arbitrary. So surely it's maybe a book where it's presenting sort of data.
It's a great question. I mean, on the face of it, I agree it does look like a bit of a contradiction. But first of all, I think I probably ought to underline the fact that I'm not against the idea of countries. I don't have a problem with countries. The way I see it is that all of the problems that the world is facing today were caused by the same thing, which is humanity, right? So we've got 7 billion individuals who've caused all the problems in one way or another. And in one way or another are going to solve them. The 7 billion is an enormously large number, and it's incredibly difficult to marshal and organize such a gigantic number. So clearly you need to break it down into efficiently governed smaller groups. Thank God we don't have to do that, because it's already been done for us. We've got 200 nations. And that basically is the way the world works, whether we like it or not. Now, you can have, we can have, and I have had many, many happy hours of pointless philosophical debate about whether the nation state is done with and whether we should now start moving back to Renaissance city-states or what have you. But I'm an old man in a hurry, and I want to see this thing happen. So I'm going to deal with what we've got at the moment, even if, because it works, even if it actually means stimulating with the, by means of this index, a little bit of that same intranational competitive spirit, which I think is the cause of most of the problems in the world today. Because the fact of the matter is it's there. And it's funny and ironic and sad, but after this index first came out, I had about 8 phone calls from governments around the world, 7 of which wanted to know what they could do in order to increase their ranking over their neighbors or their competitors, 1 of which wanted to know how much it cost to improve their ranking. And I was sorely tempted to think of a number and then double it, but I didn't. But, you know, in the end, good country, because I think countries are the unit that the world operates on. That's what we've got. They're perfectly okay as long as they behave properly. I certainly think that some of the supranational unions, the European Union really being the only successful case, are a really important sign for the future, for how things could be done. I often say this to jeers and whistles, but I happen to think that the European Union is the noblest experiment in the history of humanity. I think it's the most extraordinary episode in human history. The fact that these sovereign nations have been prepared to give up a tiny little portion of their own sovereignty, which is the best trick they've got, in the cause of the greater good. I think that's remarkable. Just thinking about it brings tears to my eyes, but I should stress, in conception, not in execution. The European Union is run by human beings, so it's a piss-up, as you would expect, in a brewery. But nonetheless, the idea is a beautiful one, and I think we need more of those. The Commonwealth is an interesting one. If we had another hour, we could talk about the Commonwealth. It's 1/3 of humanity.
Thank you for your really interesting talk.
Thank you for looking interested all the way through. It really helps.
Well, yeah, I was surprised that you didn't mention the UN more in your talk, but you've obviously talked about it just now. And yeah, my opinion is that the only way to achieve this is to make these global decisions in a more democratic way, because what you're asking with the dual mandate is to ask nations to act against their own self-interest. So I think the only way, as an economist, I think the only way you can do it is to change the incentives so that people are acting in their own self-interest for the common good.
I disagree with two parts of that, if I may. First of all, I disagree about the idea that I'm asking nations to act against their own interest. I'm not. The thing that perhaps I didn't spend quite enough time on is this idea that acting in the interest of humanity is not necessarily incompatible with acting in your own self-interest. I mean, let's just unpick that for a moment. At the very most basic level, making domestic policy on a purely domestic issue, if you do nothing more than simply benchmark that policy area against things that other countries have done in the past, you're going to make better policy as a result. And you may think that that's absolutely obvious and standard, and surely every government does it, but they don't. They really, really don't. So the basic entry level doesn't even involve actually making different policies. It just involves talking more to other countries about what they've done and sharing good practice. So that, at a very simple, almost automatic level, is spreading effective policy around the place. And almost by definition, that will create a broader beneficent effect. But then there are 7 or 8 levels above that where you start collaborating more effectively with second and third and fourth countries and groups of countries in your mutual and individual interest. I'm afraid it really does become a very long lecture if we start getting into examples of how the internationalization of domestic policy makes better domestic policy. So I won't ask you to take my word for it because that would be outrageous, but that is one of the bases on which this is founded. The other thing that I slightly disagree with is the idea that global order has to be imposed by some sort of supra-sovereign body like the United Nations. The problem with the United Nations, and indeed the problem with almost all of the multilateral institutions, is the problem of sovereignty. That any power they have is granted to them by sovereign nations. And those sovereign nations clearly are not going to want to give the UN or any other agency a stick with which it can then beat them later on. So the member states are never going to grant enough power to international agencies for those international agencies to be able to impose very much at all. The United Nations does an enormous amount of good, don't get me wrong. It's part of the reason why we're able to function at all as a globalized world today. A lot of the pipework and the plumbing that we don't see behind the scenes is all UN stuff. Organizational stuff, it does extraordinarily well. But when it comes to something like climate change, well, you can see that the United Nations is incapable of imposing anything on anybody. So I think that there isn't too much of a contradiction between those two things. If this really was asking nations to act against their own self-interest, then I would not be trying to do this, because it would be perfectly fruitless. I would love to have a head-to-head debate, although I'd probably lose, with Narendra Modi, for example, on the question of climate change, because his attitude is very classically I shouldn't call it bad country, but it's the opposite of the good country one. It's basically saying, all that matters is my citizens, they have a right to economic prosperity and growth. I don't give a fuck about the atmosphere, it's your fault. If we're all going to die, I can blame you. Which strikes me as being remarkable, really, considering what a very clever politician and intelligent man he is. And I think these are the areas of tension where I would love to have the debate. But I think it's much less of a contradiction than perhaps you frame it. I hope it is.
You mentioned that sort of initially how this good country ranking doesn't have much to do with the income of a country, how successful it is, how economically successful it is. this is based on people's perceptions, and a lot of people's
No, it's not.
perceptions is...
It's not a perception index. I may have confused you there. I talked earlier about a different index called the Nation Brands Index, which is a public opinion poll. This is not based on perceptions. This is based on reality.
Okay, right. Okay, forget that bit. A lot of... Is not a big part of this. Can countries not get stuck in a trap whereby it's difficult to become good before you have the economic growth and the finances and stuff like that? Is there not a self-repeating cycle, and is there not a big aspect of you need the money before you can focus on becoming good, and there's a lot you need to look at yourself before you can look outside, because looking outside requires the resources and the funding?
Yes, you're absolutely right, and it's a very valid point. It's not really surprising that despite the fact that the measures that are in this index are not really measures that depend very much on money, nonetheless, you do have a definite cluster of rich countries at the top and a definite cluster of poor countries at the bottom. There are some interesting anomalies, of course, as I said. I mean, China has the world's second largest economy, but it's near the bottom of the index. Now, why is that? Well, it's because China also has an extremely large population and an extremely large country going through a very difficult phase in its history. It's trying to hold itself together as it changes. And as somebody said, it's like performing brain surgery on somebody driving a car down a motorway. So it's not at all surprising if China is not thinking very hard, and up until now has not thought very hard about the rest of the world. It's fixated on its own issues, quite understandably. So one of the things that I'm very anxious to make sure people understand is that by allowing a country, by performing a calculation which allows a country to end up near the bottom of this index, I'm not criticizing or chastising them. I'm simply revealing the data. I don't blame China for being inward-looking. In fact, by looking after its own more than 1 billion people, it is looking after a significant proportion of the world's population anyway. And if I mean what I say about foreigners not being aliens, why should I care whether it's looking after Chinese people or Guatemalan people? And in a sense, that's absolutely right. So I'm not chastising countries for coming lower, nor do I think that it's at all surprising or shocking or even necessarily bad that poor countries tend to look inwards. What I'm saying is that for some of the countries in this list, for some of the 200 countries in the world, for quite a large proportion of them, they could change and benefit from changing. And that's what I'm trying to encourage here. And again, forgive me if I'm repetitious, but the fact that Kenya, a very poor country, does manage to rank very high in this index suggests that this has more to do with attitude and culture than it has to do with your own domestic problems. I mean, even asking for international help is being internationally minded. So one argument says if you're a desperately poor country that can't feed its own people, then you can be more international simply by allowing other countries to help you more. And that, if you like, is the bottom stage of becoming more international.
There's a question over there.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have two related questions. The first is about the survey you mentioned at the end of your talk. You said 10% of survey responders said they cared about something more than their own country. They cared about what happened in the real world. I wanted to ask whether what happened in the real world was defined in any objective way, or whether they cared about their own notions of good in the rest of the world, which might be different from each other. On a related point, I wanted to point out that it might be counterproductive to propose some kind of objective index, because what countries want for themselves may be different from what people in other countries think would be good for them. And so I wonder if you've considered the idea of having some sort of relative index where each country ranks other countries based on the impacts they have on it.
It's kind of a nice idea. Okay, the World Values Survey, let me clarify. This is not a poll which I've conducted, and so I have no ability to set the questions. The questions are already set and they're already answered. So basically you can look it up online. The questionnaire consists of a large number of standardized questions which asks things like, for example, would you rather live next door to a mass murderer or a homosexual? And there are plenty of people, believe me, who prefer the former. And by a process of selecting a certain number of questions, telling questions on this general theme of cosmopolitan attitude, if you like, out of that questionnaire, one can put together a kind of a cluster, a notion of what you think people's mindset is. It's very approximate. It was a question that didn't really justify finding funding to carry out a special survey. At some point we're going to do it, but at the moment what I really wanted was just a hint about what sort of proportion we're talking about. Is it most people in the world, or is it a tiny minority? It turns out it's an appreciable minority. Of course, it varies enormously from country to country. In Sweden, it's 57% of the population. More than half Swedish people have got the mindset typified by answering in a certain way those questions. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's less than 1%, as you would expect. To your second point, it is a cool idea, but the trouble is that it then sounds as if you're going back to opinion polling again. Because insofar as it's possible to get objective data on this kind of performance, this is the objective data. It's measured by the United Nations, predominantly. What you're suggesting sounds a bit more like a perception study, where you're asking countries what they feel another country does for them. And that would be inaccurate by definition, because people's perceptions, as I know from my other research, are so often dramatically different from the reality. And right now, I'm interested in reality more than I'm interested in perceptions. But having said that, there are some tweaks to the Good Country Index, which I'm trying to include for the next edition, which is going to be coming out in the next few weeks. I don't know whether we'll be able to yet. But one of them is on the question of weighting, which is often a question that comes up. How do you account for the relative importance of each of these issues? I mean, you know, in health and well-being, there's a database there about the amount of illicit drugs which each country exports into the world as a measure of harm. And so the question comes, well, is selling a ton of cocaine worse than killing 100 people? Or is it better than emitting 100 tons of carbon dioxide? How on earth can you possibly decide? And the only possible answer is you don't. You just leave it completely vanilla and unweighted. The thing that I want to include in the next edition is to allow people to perform their own weighting. So they can conduct a little survey on themselves at the beginning that says, I think climate change is more important than peace and prosperity. And based on that personal weighting, it will do your own ranking. So you can say, according to my view of the world, America should be number one, which is, seems to be much desired.
So just a quick follow-up. I totally agree that you don't want to just be doing perception.
Right.
But, you know, so there are objective facts about the ways that countries influence each other, and then there are how much people like those objective
Right.
facts if they knew what they were. And what I'm trying to say is that for any ranking system you do, even one which allows you to weight coefficients differently, because presumably people are just going to do like linear sums of these things, which leaves out a lot of options. For any weighting that you do, it might be that it doesn't represent what people actually want.
Right. Yeah. Do you know, that's one very valid challenge from a list of about 9,865 challenges to this whole idea. This is always a really difficult thing to say because it sounds as if I'm not standing by the work. I am. I think it's a cool piece of work and I love it and I'm glad I did it and I'll continue to do it. But in the end, this cannot be and never will be, even in the vaguest possible sense, a proper account of how the world works. Because so many things, as I said before, are simply not convertible into data. So there are two responses to that. The first one is, one of the things I would like to do at some point, and this will require some funding, is to start doing country-specific studies rather than a comparative ranking. A comparative ranking is the very devil, because you have to do all kinds of things that just don't make sense. But a country-by-country study, on the other hand, can be qualitative rather than quantitative, and it can be really interesting and really informative. It requires a large staff, it requires a lot of funding, but to start doing an annual yearbook on a dozen or 3 dozen or 200 countries, saying, here's the balance sheet for this country at the end of the year. Here's the good they appear to have done to their neighbors and the rest of the world, and here are the things which might be more harmful. And it discusses them. That's one thing I would very much like to do. But the other thing I have to say, and this is the tough thing to say, is that in the end, my aim with this whole project is not to measure things. My aim is to change things. And the Good Country Index is a tool of public diplomacy more than a tool of evaluation. It is a way of getting across not just a message, but a way of thinking about the world, which it does quite well. The mere fact that we're having this conversation now suggests that we're all doing what I want us to be doing, which is to be asking these kinds of questions about countries, their impact on the world, which, believe it or not, is a type of question which is very, very seldom asked. So simply by virtue of its existence, its very flawed existence, this survey does something. It shows that there's more than one way of measuring a country. Every other survey out there, I think almost without exception, measures internally how countries treat their own people. Now we've got one that measures externally what countries do as actors, as agents in a globalized world, and so it's done something already. One day, I'll have the money to have a team of smart statisticians who can produce this in a much more robust and rigorous form. And I don't mean to demean the sterling efforts of my colleagues who put this together and did an amazing job, but in the end, we're constrained by the data. That sounded like an excuse, and it is. Just above you.
Question over there?
Thank you for the interesting talk. First of all, I would really like to disagree with you about that Narendra Modi thing. I definitely don't think he's an intelligent or a clever politician.
Okay, that makes things easier.
I'm from India, and I can certainly say he's the least intelligent politician or prime minister we have ever had. I don't know how he was voted to power. Anyway, what I wanted to ask you, at the initial part of the talk, you were talking about how this perception of a country also affects how much we want to invest in other countries. And I do know for a fact that India doesn't really do much for other countries, but how do you explain then, in terms of perception, the growing foreign investment in India? Like last year, India surpassed the US and China as far as FDI in greenfield projects were concerned. So how do you explain that? Like, even with a bad perception, why are people still investing so much in India?
Because it's a good country to invest in. My point is certainly not that being a good country is either the only or indeed the most important reason why a country might do well economically in the short to medium term. There are plenty of countries that do extraordinarily well. Because in the end, particularly professional investors are not primarily driven by the idea that the country is good or bad. It may impact their decision at some level. It almost certainly does at some level. But first and foremost, investment decisions are practical business decisions. They are based on how much money you're going to make. So the speed at which the country's economy is growing, the pervasiveness of the rule of law, the stability of the government, the repatriation of profits, the friendliness of the regime, the communications infrastructure, the other companies that are already invested in there, all of those are arguments which are going to carry far more weight than any of this. But investment is not the whole story. And when you come to, if you like, more mass market economic effects like tourism, tourism is perhaps the classic one, then you've got ordinary people, not expert investors, who are being driven by more, shall we say, emotional factors. So there's evidence from almost every area, whether it's foreign direct investment, whether it's tourism, whether it's cultural relations, whether it's trade or export or anything of that sort, that can demonstrate that at some level, at varying levels, perceptions of the country's image, its positive or negative image, play into those decisions. And to some degree or another, they play into all of them. But I'm not saying, and I would be dumb to say it, that there is a direct correlation between the Good Country Index and investment performance or economic growth or anything of the sort. The two things are connected, even causally, but not directly. That doesn't mean, though, however, that pushing from the Good Country end is not going to produce a result. It will, simply because the voice of those 700 million people is such a very loud voice that it has the power to override decisions, short-term decisions made by governments. I'm glad you disagree with me about Narendra Modi because I don't know the man, and I was being diplomatic.
Some questions over there?
Hi, I was just wondering if as you say, sort of being a good country, at least to some extent, is actually a positive thing, even for the individual country, sort of economically and in general. Why has there not been more convergence on it as a strategy for countries to achieve? Are we just quite bad at governance that we don't spot a good strategy, which could well be the case, or do you think there are any sort of underlying causes for it?
It's a really interesting question. I hope it's because I haven't been saying this for very long, and it's a relatively new idea. I hope that's the reason. I have some evidence to support that. The countries that I've advised personally have tended to listen and pay attention, and as I said at the beginning, to some degree, changing some of their policies because they're attracted by the idea, and it does make some sense to them. It may well be that I'm a little bit early. I think the other reason why it hasn't caught on, I mean, it would be vain and foolish to say the only reason it hasn't caught on is because I haven't said it loudly enough. But I think perhaps the other reason is that there is an extraordinary inertia in systems like political culture and economic thinking, as we know. I mean, the mere existence of CSEP today in 2016, these are ideas which have been around since the early 60s, that economics is a science that needs to consider soft factors like human beings and why they behave the way they do. These systems are very, very slow to change. And the way that the world is organized, the way that states relate to each other, the way that multilateralism is choreographed and orchestrated is still based very, very firmly on a neoliberal system, which, like the neoliberal economic system, presumes that every nation is a self-interested, selfish player. And all of the politicians in the world have been trained in that model and brought up to believe that that's their job, that's the nature of the task, and that's how they should perform. When I come along and suggest to them that perhaps it doesn't work like that, understandably, they are polite but skeptical. And it would take enormous courage on the part of one state to go another way. It's funny, I was woken up at 2:30 in the morning about 3 months ago by a voice very distinctly saying my name in my ear. And I immediately woke up, and the voice then said, while you're waiting for this to happen in reality, why not make it happen in fiction? I don't know where the voice came from. I think it must have been inside my head, but I scribbled down a note so I'd remember it the next morning, and I thought, actually, let's make a damn fine film. If you took a country like India, for example, let's just suppose that by some series of freak coincidences, somebody who was not Narendra Modi was elected to power, and he or she decided that actually they were going to get elected and they were going to run the country on a ticket of goodness, that they were going to become the goodest country on earth. And this Gandhi-like figure would go to all the international meetings and summits and would be arguing for the benefit of humanity, even occasionally, carefully, perhaps, to the de-benefit of his or her own population from time to time. It would be fantastic and fascinating to get a movie director or a scriptwriter or a novelist to just follow that through and wargame it and see where it went. I can tell you what would happen because we've seen it before. When people like Nelson Mandela or even occasionally Lula da Silva turn up in international meetings and argue for humanity, they are immediately accepted as the de facto leader of the group. It always happens because they're talking at a higher level than everybody else. And so they end up dominating the proceedings. So it might not necessarily end up with that country getting shafted.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that inspirational talk. I'll now hand over to my colleague Simon, who will explain some of the opportunities available at the Society of Economic Pluralism if you have been inspired to put these ideas into practice.
Fantastic. Just very briefly, the next event for CSEP is an event on what is CSEP and why join it. This term we have our committee elections. Now, as you can see, we run fantastic events on a weekly basis with external speakers. Not only do you get to meet them, you go to a dinner afterwards, and I personally love to join being a part of society, learning about different areas of economics, and really engaging with the conception of pluralism, however vague or odd that may sound. So our next event is on the 23rd, this Saturday, at 7:30 in St. Catherine's College in the Ramsden Room. We're just going to be explaining about the society, and afterwards we have our elections on the 5th of February. So pick up a term card and follow us on Facebook, or join our email list so you can see more information on what we do and how you might be able to get involved.
Once again, thank you very much, Simon.
And if you've got any answers to my questions, please email them to me. Simon@good.country. No, it doesn't say. Simon@good.country. And I need some answers quickly.
Fantastic. And if you can fill in the feedback form just at the top, that would be great. One way.